Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. It's been a little while since we've looked at a piece of art in depth on this channel, and as those kinds of video are some of my favourites to make, I think it's time. The focus for today is perhaps on the more obscure side, even though the piece is on permanent display at Hampton Court Palace, on the processional route between the Great Watching Chamber and the Chapel Royal, an area that is known by some as the Haunted Gallery. I've chosen the image for today because, one, I think it's cool, and two, I wonder if we can use it to provide greater context for one of the more contested issues in Tudor history. What Henry VIII actually believed. What his faith was. Let's go. So, King Henry VIII's true faith is confusing. On the one hand, he split England from the Roman Catholic Church. So, he's a reformer, if not a Protestant, right? On the other hand, we're often reminded that Henry is born a Catholic and dies a Catholic. He's a Roman Catholic who dies an English Catholic. What's going on? Why did he do what he did? Was he driven by faith or self-interest? What did he believe? Before we dive into today's piece of art, let's look at some of the key things that Henry did in matters of religion. Now, this won't be a complete roadmap of Reformation because that's a multi-part documentary series of hour-long episodes. But I do want to see if we can excavate Henry's thought process, his motivations, if you will. Where do faith, avarice, self-interest, hunger for power, and even lust intersect? From near the start of his reign, Henry's favour and preferment fell upon the Roman Catholic priest Thomas Wolsey, who in 1515 became Lord High Chancellor of England and Archbishop of York. Martin Luther's 95 Theses from 1517 and his De Captivitate Babylonica, or On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, that was published in 1520, were a challenge to the papacy, which evidently displeased Henry VIII, loyal, spiritual son of the Pope that he apparently was. In 1521, Henry's own text, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, or the Defence of the Seven Sacraments, was his rebuttal to Luther. Pope Leo X rewarded Henry with the title of Defender of the Faith. It was to the Pope, this time Pope Clement VII, that Henry turned in 1527, while he was seeking to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. A Legantine commission, ostensibly empowered to act on the Pope's behalf, would sit in Blackfriars in 1529. But in the August of the same year as Henry's application to Pope Clement VII for 1527, he was also applying for a dispensation, this time to be able to marry Anne, since they were also connected by a prohibited degree of affinity because he had slept with her sister. So far then, it's to the Church of Rome that Henry turns, for his advisors, with his support, and for help with ensuring the security of his nation. At least that was how he saw his annulment and hoped for marriage to Anne. Things start to break down when the Pope was unwilling or unable to give Henry what he wanted. Henry's hoped for annulment was delayed and put off, which displeased him. His marriage to Catherine was, he said, sinful, incestuous and displeasing to God, due to her having been his brother's wife. Those were his divinely inspired moral objections, he said. To compound matters, Catherine had borne him one living daughter and no surviving sons. She was in good health, but, it is believed, post-menopausal. Then there was Anne Boleyn, his wife's lady-in-waiting, who was younger, fertile and thus might bear sons. She had also refused to become Henry's mistress. In 1529, the failure of Henry's suit to Rome saw Thomas Wolsey fall from favour. He was charged with praemunere, the illegal support of a foreign power, here being the papacy, over matters more properly under the English crown's jurisdiction. In 1531, the next charge of praemunere was levelled against the English clergy. A pardon would cost the convocation £100,000, and the clergy would be required to recognise Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. Convocation was willing to find the funds, but wanted compromise on the headship question. Henry could be the supreme head of the Church of England, as far as the law of Christ allows. In 1533, Parliament passed an Act in Restraint of Appeals. No longer could ecclesiastical court matters be appealed to Rome. Any English finding would be final and binding. Following this, on the 23rd of May 1533, Catherine and Henry's marriage was found to be null and void, while his recently made marriage to Anne Boleyn was valid. There was probably no hope of a reconciliation between Henry and the papacy following Henry's marriage to Anne, which was bigamous in the eyes of Rome, and was probably spurred on by Anne's pregnancy, that resulted in the birth of Elizabeth on the 7th of September 1533. They now held two different worldviews. To the Pope, Catherine was Henry's true wife, Mary his heir, Anne his mistress, and Elizabeth a bastard. Henry claimed that he viewed Catherine as his brother's wife, Mary as the bastard, Anne as his first true wife, and Elizabeth as his heir. In 1534, Henry's royal supremacy over the church was enshrined into law in England. The clergy was made to submit. Henry was supreme head of the Church of England, whatever the laws of Christ allowed. To deny it was treason, and would be punishable as such. Anne would fall spectacularly 2 years after the Act of Supremacy, and just 3 years after she had become Henry's queen. As we know, she was executed in 1536. Anne Boleyn is frequently positioned as one of the key motivating forces for Henry to travel down the road to Reformation. It is said he was desperate for a solution, due to his love or lust for her, and from her continental education among scholars of the new religion, she, it is said, brought the literature that would guide Henry away from Rome. However Henry got to Reformation, it is clear that Anne's fall was not sufficient to turn him from it. Indeed, he seems to have leaned into it, because when the Pilgrimage of Grace against the changing religious policies commenced later in 1536, Henry's next wife, Jane Seymour, sought to intercede on the rebels' behalf with her royal husband. She begged him to restore the abbeys. In response, Henry reminded her threateningly of the fate of her politically meddling predecessor. For the rest of Henry's reign, matters of doctrine and how or when they would be enforced in law was, to say the least, confusing. For example, the iconoclastic destruction of so-called superstitious shrines and the dissolution of the monasteries was still underway in 1539, when the Act of 6 Articles was issued, which upheld in law a number of traditionally Catholic doctrines and practices. The Act supported the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, namely that the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ in reality. It also supported the view that one need not receive both bread and wine in the communion, the obligation of priests to remain celibate, the binding character of vows of chastity, the value of private masses, and of auricular confession. Alongside Anne Boleyn, another individual often credited with keeping Henry bent more towards reform was Thomas Cromwell. He is frequently positioned as the individual spearheading the profitable attack on monasticism in England that, in turn, filled the royal coffers. It was Cromwell's unsuccessful interference in the king's personal life, namely his making of the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, that brought him down. He was beheaded on Tower Hill on the 28th of July, 1540. Still, his fall also did not stop the Reformation in England in its tracks. Henry VIII allowed, even fostered, faction within his court. It was increasingly adversarial, as religious reformers and conservatives struggled to shape the faith identity and character of their nation. Henry gave ground on both sides, perhaps motivated by spiritual conscience, perhaps due to political drivers. Maybe it was 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. However, this only increased the jeopardy. Matters of religion and fealty in Henrician England could be a life-threatening tightrope. Perhaps this was arguably most clearly exemplified on the 30th of July 1540, which was 2 days after the execution of Thomas Cromwell. On that date, 6 men were executed. 3 were reformers: Robert Barnes, Thomas Garrett or Garrard, and William Jerome. They were burned at the stake for heresy. The other 3 were conservatives: Thomas Abel, Edward Powell, and Richard Featherstone, who were, according to Edward Hall, quote, hanged, headed and quartered for treason, for denying the king's supremacy and affirming that his marriage with the Lady Catherine was good. These executions were a message. Too far in either direction in matters of faith could result in the ultimate punishment. There was a line to be towed, and Henry, seemingly, reserved the right to define and also shift that line. Spiritual flexibility would be, I would argue, a useful tool for survival. Another sign of the confusing state of affairs can be found in the fact that while the conservative-leaning 1539 6 articles remained in place until they were repealed during the reign of Edward VI, they were ultimately rarely used. Eric Ives explains that, quote, over 7 years, only 20 people died under its provisions. In 1541, the year after the 6-person execution, a fine was instituted for the parishes that did not buy a copy of the Henry-approved translation of the Bible in English, the so-called Great Bible. Also, feast days were abolished. Any remaining shrines were ordered to be destroyed. A statement of faith was presented in 1543 with Henry's blessing. Known as the King's Book, it was something of a hodgepodge of reformist and conservative values. Just as Henry had done in his 1521 text that earned him the title of Defender of the Faith from a grateful Pope, the value of the 7 sacraments was once again asserted, thus opposing the reforming idea of justification by faith alone. However, readers are also informed that, as reformers would wish, mention of purgatory was to be abstained from. I'm not sure if either side would have been pleased. But then, in 1546, the conservative court faction moved against Henry's reform-minded 6th wife, Catherine Parr, seemingly successfully. Henry allowed an arrest warrant to be issued for her on a charge of heresy. Only her total supplication before her husband seems to have saved her life. But although he cancelled the arrest warrant, he did allow the guards to come for her, which let him box their ears and send them on their way. Was this just a message to both? You've been fighting for too long. I've let each of you think you have the upper hand, and now I'm putting you both back in your place. Wife and councillors. Henry's Church of England was not Roman Catholic, nor was it Protestant. If anything, it was a pick-a-mix of both. But this piece was in Henry's collection by his death in 1547. It has an estimated date of creation of between 1538 and 1544, although it has been suggested that that date may be narrowed down to between after 1542, as it wasn't in the royal inventory of that year, and 1544, which was the year that the artist Girolamo da Treviso died in the siege of Boulogne. It's not clear who commissioned this work, but as Girolamo da Treviso was at the English court and in Henry's service from 1538, it may have been commissioned by the king himself. The piece is now known as a Protestant allegory, while in the inventory of 1547 it was listed as, quote, a table of the Bishop of Rome and the 4 evangelists casting stones upon him. The viewer is presented with an image of a fallen pope. He is laying on top of 2 female figures, possibly nuns, who represent avarice and hypocrisy, which were frequent allegations levelled against the See of Rome by the Reformers. On the ground in front of the fallen pope is a document with seals, probably a papal bull. There is a cardinal's hat and a candle that has been extinguished beneath a cooking pan. Perhaps this might be read as a comment on how worldly concerns of the flesh, or even the cardinal sin of greed, had been allowed to thrive within the Roman Church, and as a result had caused the divine light of God and of the Gospels to be extinguished in favour of false doctrine. The group on the floor are surrounded by 4 male figures with halos, who are preparing to cast stones, or rather rocks, upon them. Each rock is labelled for the biblical evangelists. From left to right, we have John, Matthew, Luke, and Mark. In the distance is a city. Above it, a lit candle burns. The city is thought to be Jerusalem. The flame, the true light of God and the Gospels, which, after the 1534 Act of Supremacy, had also burned in Henry's Church of England. The moral, faith-based motivations for the entire English Reformation are being writ large here, in a work that was likely to have been created nearly a decade after it took place. This is one of 3 anti-papal pictures that Henry VIII is known to have owned. Without its frame, the piece is 67.9 by 84.4 centimetres, which, for context, is about the same as 6 stacked cola cans tall. So, not massively big in relation to the other canvases on the walls of Hampton Court. I think this relatively small size, coupled with the fact that it is principally created in shades of grey, contributes to this piece being somewhat overlooked. The delicate application of gilding, the detailed figures and the wording calls for close-up attention. In short, I can see how this piece could be missed, but I hope you'll look out for it, if or when you head to Hampton Court Palace. But what do you think? How did you understand Henry's motivations for the Reformation before? Has the evidence we've explored today changed your mind? And if so, how? If not, why? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video, or you can find me on social media. I'll leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Follow me over on some or all of them so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, have a little check now. Make sure YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. While you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.